a father, a struggle, a miracle. As Jack fought to keep his family together, life led him down an unexpected path. An accident, a rescue, and a life-changing moment. Sometimes, life brings the greatest hope in the darkest times. Please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. Jack had been working at a factory for years, fighting every day for his wife and his 5-year-old son Nick. Lately, problems had been hanging over his family like dark clouds, weighing heavily on his shoulders. Nick was going through a tough time due to a rare and complicated kidney condition. The doctors had said that for him to live a healthy life, expensive medication and regular treatments were necessary. For Jack and his wife, this meant facing a deepening financial crisis with each passing day. Jack's wife had started looking for a job to help support the family budget, but so far no opportunity had come her way. This situation had turned into a nightmare that constantly haunted Jack's mind. He was holding on to his job at the factory with everything he had, but things were about to get worse. That day, as he worked on the factory floor, Jack noticed that everyone was whispering about something. Faces were tense and conversations were filled with worry. Jack listened closely and what he heard hit him like a ton of bricks. The factory management had announced that 100 employees with expiring contracts would be laid off. There would be no contract renewals and these workers would have to leave in a few weeks. Jack felt a chill run through him. His own contract had expired just a few days ago. The supervisors had assured him that it would be renewed soon, but now he struggled to believe that. They're going to fire me too. Definitely me, he muttered under his breath, his thoughts racing. Nick's face appeared in his mind. He remembered the moment his son, lying in his bed, had reached out with his little hands and asked, "I'll get better, right, Dad?" Jack's heart clenched. If he lost this job, how would he take care of his family? How would he afford Nick's expensive medication? These worries swirled around in his head like a storm, filling him with fear and helplessness. The factory wasn't quiet, machines roared and metal parts clanged together, but Jack felt trapped in his own thoughts, disconnected from the noise around him. The fear of losing his job had grown so large that it threatened to throw his life completely off balance. He had no idea how he was going to pull through. All he could think about was his family's future. After finishing his shift, Jack walked out of the factory with heavy steps. The sky had darkened, covered by thick clouds, and soft snowflakes were gently falling, sparkling under the streetlights. His thoughts weighed him down with each step. He had no idea how he was going to explain the situation to his wife. The rumors about being laid off were suffocating him. What if they don't renew my contract? What's going to happen to my family? He kept thinking. Nick's expensive medications, his wife struggled to find a job, the piling bills. Everything was crashing down on him. Maybe he needed to start looking for a new job before he got fired, but he didn't know where to begin. Lost in these thoughts, he unintentionally wandered off his usual route and turned onto a different street. Time slipped away as he kept walking aimlessly. Eventually, a daycare center caught his eye at the end of the road. The joyful laughter of children playing in the yard filled the air. Jack stopped and watched them for a while, mesmerized by the sight. The kids were running around, laughing and playing in the snow. A deep wish surfaced in his heart. Will Nick ever be able to run and play like that? He wondered, feeling a painful pang of sadness. Just then, a little girl in the corner of the yard caught his attention. She had noticed a cat and started chasing after it. Jack's eyes followed her as he noticed the security guard on his phone, completely unaware of the situation. The girl ran beyond the yard's boundary, heading toward the street. Jack's eyes widened and instinctively he yelled out, "No! Stop!" But the little girl didn't stop. Her small feet moved quickly over the snowy ground as she kept chasing the cat. Jack suddenly noticed a car speeding into the street. His heart sank in fear. "Damn it! Stop!" he shouted again. It was too late. The car hit the girl and sped off, disappearing from sight. For a moment, the world went silent. Jack couldn't breathe, but he quickly regained his senses and sprinted toward the scene. His heart pounded wildly in his chest. The little girl lay motionless on the ground, unconscious. The security guard, hearing the commotion, finally rushed over, but it was already too late. Jack knelt beside the girl, gently laying her on a flat surface. He checked her pulse, weak and irregular. "Hang in there, little one. You can do it," Jack whispered, his voice trembling with fear. He pulled out his phone and quickly called 911. As he waited for the ambulance, the girl's pulse faded almost completely. Panic surged through him as he looked around desperately, then made a decision. "Damn it! I can't give up now," he muttered and started performing CPR. His hands trembled as he pressed down on her chest. He kept checking her pulse between compressions. After a few moments, he felt a faint rhythm. Yes, that's it. Come on, breathe, he said to himself as he continued the CPR. Slowly, her pulse grew steadier. Jack let out a deep breath but didn't relax. He couldn't, not yet. When he heard the distant sound of ambulance sirens, a glimmer of hope appeared on his face. The paramedics arrived quickly. Jack stepped back, stopping the chest compressions as they placed the girl on a stretcher and began emergency treatment. One of the paramedics looked at him and spoke. You did an amazing job. Her heart stabilizing, he said. Jack exhaled deeply, exhausted but relieved. Jack stood frozen for a moment, staring after the ambulance as it sped away. The horror of what had just happened still echoed in his mind. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. God, please help her, he whispered. Then, trying to clear his head, he slowly walked away from the scene. His thoughts swirled in a tangled mess as he made his way home. When he quietly opened the door and stepped inside, he was met with the warmth of their small living room. Nick was lying on a makeshift bed in the middle of the room. Jack knelt beside him and kissed his forehead gently. How are you feeling, little man? He asked softly. Nick gave a small smile, but there was still exhaustion in his eyes. I'll be okay, Dad, he said, though his voice carried a hint of sadness. Jack's heart clenched once again. He had to do whatever it took to make sure his son got the care he needed. Jack got up and walked toward the kitchen. His wife was at the stove, stirring a pot. The steam from the food filled the kitchen with a comforting warmth. Why did you move his bed into the living room? Jack asked curiously. His wife hesitated before answering. So he wouldn't feel lonely, and also. She paused briefly, then continued. Heating the whole house is getting too expensive. If we all sleep in the living room, we only have to keep this area warm. Jack felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. He walked over and kissed her gently on the forehead. That's really smart. Thank you, he said in a soft voice. But in that moment, he couldn't bring himself to tell her about the possibility of losing his job. He didn't want to add to her worries. For now, he decided to keep it to himself. The next morning, Jack left for work as usual. Throughout the day, he tried to gather information, listening in on conversations among the workers. Everyone was on edge. Many were talking about their uncertain future, but so far no official announcements had been made. The waiting was agonizing, pushing Jack's patience to its limits. He worked with a heavy heart, the same thought looping in his mind. Will they renew my contract? Or is this the end of everything? The uncertainty was eating him alive. He felt like bad news could come at any moment. But what Jack didn't know was that his life was about to change completely. And that change would be far bigger than he ever expected. When Jack got home, the same heavy atmosphere still lingered in the air. Nick was resting in the living room, wrapped up in a warm blanket. Jack pushed aside his worries for a moment and sat beside his son, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. The little boy looked up at him with a faint smile. Dad, I'm going to get better, right? He asked in a weak voice. Jack felt a lump in his throat as he looked at his son's frail little body. Seeing him like this was his worst nightmare. No matter how much fear was eating away at him, he had to give Nick hope. Of course you will, little man, he said with a reassuring smile. I'll do everything I can to make sure of it. Just then, the sound of tires rolling to a stop outside caught Jack's attention. A pair of headlights flashed through the living room window, illuminating the room for a brief moment. Jack frowned and glanced outside, surprised to see two luxury cars parked in front of their house. Cars like these didn't belong in their neighborhood. A strange feeling settled in his chest as he tried to get a better look at the passengers inside. They can't be here for us, he thought. Assuming they were visiting someone else, he turned back toward his wife. But just seconds later there was a knock at the door. Jack hesitated for a moment before walking over and opening it. Standing before him was a well-dressed woman in her mid-30s, exuding elegance and confidence. Behind her were two bodyguards. She spoke with a polite but firm tone. Hello, my name is Elizabeth, she said with a slight smile. You helped a little girl yesterday. Someone in the neighborhood who knows you shared your name, number, and address with me. I apologize for coming unannounced. I hope I'm not intruding. Jack was still trying to process everything when Elizabeth continued. I actually tried calling first, but your phone was off. It was only then that Jack realized he had completely forgotten about his dead phone battery. He gave an embarrassed nod. Oh, yeah. My phone died, he admitted. Meanwhile, Jack's wife peeked through the doorway, curiosity written all over her face. Elizabeth turned back to Jack and spoke in a more serious tone. Could we talk for a moment? Jack hesitated but didn't sense anything threatening about her. With a slight frown of confusion, he nodded. "Ah. Sure, come in," he said, stepping aside to let them in. As Elizabeth stepped inside, her eyes immediately landed on Nick, lying weakly in the living room. For a moment, something in her expression softened. Jack's wife, ever the gracious host, quickly offered a glass of water. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked kindly. Elizabeth gave a small, appreciative smile but shook her head. "Thank you, but I just wanted to talk. I won't take up too much of your time." She took a deep breath before speaking. "The hit and run yesterday. I was terrified. I can't even begin to tell you how grateful I am." Her eyes glistened with emotion. Jack instinctively leaned forward. "Is she okay?" he asked urgently. Elizabeth nodded quickly. "Oh yes. Yes, thanks to you. When I found out you performed CPR and brought her back." Her voice caught in her throat, and a few tears slipped down her face. Jack's wife gently reached for Elizabeth's hand. "I can only imagine how hard that must have been for you." "I'm so sorry," she said sincerely. Elizabeth wiped her tears and pulled herself together. "She's okay now and she'll be fine," she said, her voice still slightly unsteady. "But I owe that to you. That security guard was careless, but you saved her." Jack gave a small nod. "Of course. Anyone would have done the same," he said modestly. Elizabeth held his gaze. "But you did it. And you stayed calm." She emphasized each word. "Thank you." Just as she was about to stand up and leave, her eyes landed on Nick again. The little boy was quietly listening, his eyes filled with curiosity. Elizabeth's expression softened. "Nick, right?" she asked. Jack nodded. "Yes, my son." Elizabeth took a longer look at him, noticing the weakness in his small frame. Her curiosity deepened, along with a trace of concern. "What happened to him?" she asked hesitantly. Jack was silent for a moment before exhaling deeply. "He has a rare condition. A serious issue with his kidneys. The treatment is complicated and expensive. We've been fighting for a long time, but it hasn't been easy," he admitted, his voice heavy with sorrow. Elizabeth's gaze dropped to the floor. She was quiet for a few seconds, lost in thought. Then she lifted her head and looked at Jack. "I see. I'm so sorry," she said sincerely. She turned toward the door as if she was about to leave, but then suddenly stopped in her tracks. After a brief pause, she turned back to Jack, her expression more determined. "Jack, take your wife and Nick. Let me introduce you to a specialist," she said. "He's a close friend of mine and someone I work with. At the very least, he can give you more insight. And if there's anything that can be done, we'll do it." Jack was speechless for a moment, his eyes widening in shock. A complete stranger was offering a chance that could change their lives. His pride whispered that he should refuse, but then he looked at Nick. He would do anything for his son. Jack took a deep breath and nodded. "All right," he said quietly. Then he turned to his wife. "Get ready. We're going." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "Please follow us." Jack, his wife, and Nick grabbed their coats and stepped into one of the luxury cars. As they drove away, leaving their neighborhood behind, they soon arrived in front of one of the city's most prestigious private hospitals. Jack stared up at the brightly lit building, unable to believe what was happening. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally about to change. The moment Jack stepped into the hospital, he knew this place was different from any other hospital he had been to. The hallways were spacious, spotless, and designed with modern elegance. The staff was professional yet warm and welcoming. But what stood out the most was the way the hospital employees treated Elizabeth. Doctors and nurses seemed to recognize her, respectfully nodding as she walked past. Jack noticed this and felt his curiosity growing. Who exactly is Elizabeth? And why does she command so much respect here? He wondered. But for now there was something far more important, Nick's health. A nurse led them straight to a specialist's office without any wait. The doctor, a middle-aged man with an energetic presence, greeted them with a warm smile before beginning his examination of Nick. He carefully listened to the boy's heartbeat and breathing, then ran a few reflex tests. Nick looked a little nervous, but the doctor reassured him with a friendly smile. "You know, we have an amazing movie room here just for kids. The nurse can take you there and you can watch a fun movie while we talk," he said. Nick's eyes lit up slightly. "Really?" he asked excitedly. The doctor nodded. "Absolutely. I'm sure you'll have a great time." The nurse gently took Nick's hand and led him out of the room. Jack and his wife could barely contain their anticipation. Elizabeth remained quietly beside them. As soon as Nick left, the doctor's expression became more serious. The previous diagnosis was correct. "Unfortunately, it's a rare and complicated condition," he said in a solemn tone. Jack and his wife listened intently, not blinking. The doctor leaned back slightly. "However," he paused, "there is a treatment." Jack and his wife immediately lifted their heads, a spark of hope appearing in their eyes. "A specialized device developed in Sweden has been designed specifically to address this condition," the doctor continued. "Once implanted, a short period of medication follows, and after that the patient can live a completely normal, healthy life." Jack's heart pounded. "So, there's a solution?" he asked, almost afraid to believe it. The doctor nodded. "Yes. If Nick undergoes this procedure, he will recover fully." Jack and his wife sat in silence for a few seconds. They had been receiving bad news for so long that it took a moment for this good news to sink in. But that flicker of hope in their eyes, it was real. Then reality struck. Jack took a deep breath and asked the inevitable question. "How much?" The doctor hesitated slightly before turning to Elizabeth. Elizabeth met Jack in his wife's eyes and spoke in a gentle voice. "All expenses will be covered. You don't need to worry," she said. Jack froze for a moment. His wife's lips parted slightly, her eyes welling up with tears. Jack turned to Elizabeth, his voice unsteady. "Thank you. I don't even know how we could ever repay you." Elizabeth gave him a warm smile. "You saved my daughter's life. Helping with this treatment is the least I can do," she said. "Honestly, I'm just glad I can do something." The doctor nodded in agreement. "This device is highly specialized and not easy to find. But with Elizabeth involved, I'm sure we'll secure it quickly." Jack's confusion deepened. "What exactly do you do?" he asked curiously. Elizabeth smiled slightly. "I own a medical manufacturing company. It's been in my family for generations and now I run it," she explained. "Because of these connections we can move things along faster." Jack's wife, with tears in her eyes, reached for Elizabeth's hand. "We are so incredibly grateful. We'll never forget this," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Elizabeth nodded sincerely. "It's okay. What matters is Nick's health." Everything moved quickly after that. Nick was admitted to the hospital, and preparations were made for both pre- and post-surgery care. Jack spent every evening at the hospital after work, staying by Nick and his wife's side. Each passing day hope grew stronger. But then one day while at the hospital, Jack's phone rang. It was one of his co-workers from the factory. When Jack answered, the man on the other end took a deep breath. "Man, bad news. The management just made it official. Everyone whose contract expired is getting laid off," he said regretfully. Jack paused for a moment. Normally this news would have crushed him. But right now his priorities were crystal clear. Nick was going to get better. Jobs could be found, but his son's health was everything. "That's all right," he said calmly. "I'll find something else. Thanks for letting me know." As he hung up and turned around, he found Elizabeth watching him. Her gaze was quiet but knowing, almost as if she understood exactly what was going through his mind. But Jack didn't say anything and neither did she. That night, the final preparations were made. Nick's surgery was scheduled for the next morning. Jack told his wife that he had taken time off work for the procedure. In reality, he had lost his job, but he didn't want to burden her with that worry. Right now, the only thing that mattered was Nick's surgery. The morning of the operation, everyone was ready in the hospital room. Jack held Nick's small hands and in his heart, one thought echoed over and over: this is going to be our new beginning. The next day, as Jack and his wife waited in the hospital room for news of Nick's surgery, time seemed to stand still. Hours passed, their excitement and fear blending together. Jack held his wife's hand often, trying to reassure her, but deep down, anxiety consumed him. His son was fighting a battle far too big for his small body. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the doors of the operating room swung open, and the doctor stepped out. As he walked toward them with a smile, Jack and his wife jumped to their feet. "Everything went well," the doctor said with a reassuring grin. "The surgery was a success. Nick is going to make a full recovery." Jack and his wife collapsed into each other's arms, tears streaming down their faces, but this time they were tears of joy. Elizabeth gave a small nod, smiling. "Congratulations," she said sincerely. "I'm truly happy for you." Shortly after, Nick was brought back to his room. He still looked a little weak, but his mother sat beside him, gently stroking his hair. When the little boy opened his eyes, he looked up at Jack and his mother and asked in a soft voice, "Dad, am I getting better?" Jack struggled to hold back his tears as he took his son's small hands in his own. "Yes, son. You're completely healing now." Elizabeth placed a gentle hand on Jack's shoulder. "Can I talk to you for a second?" she asked. Jack, a little surprised but curious, followed her into the hallway. Elizabeth's expression was serious but friendly as she spoke. "Jack, I assume you've run into some trouble with your job, haven't you?" Jack hesitated for a moment but then straightened his shoulders. "I'll figure it out," he replied confidently. Elizabeth tilted her head slightly. "If you're looking for work, my door is open," she said firmly. Jack was at a loss for words. "Are you serious?" he asked, stunned. Elizabeth smiled and nodded. "I am. We're hiring at my factory. And the conditions are quite good." Jack took a deep breath. Another miracle was unfolding before him. "Elizabeth. I don't even know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elizabeth lifted a hand dismissively. "You don't have to thank me, Jack. You saved my daughter's life. This isn't just a favor, it's simply the right thing to do." A few weeks later, Jack started his new job. And he quickly realized that the working conditions were far better than at his previous factory. He could finally provide for his family without constant stress, and more importantly, Nick's future was secure. For the first time in a long time, Jack came home each night without being weighed down by worries about debt or fear of what was coming next. Meanwhile, Nick was recovering quickly. Each day he grew stronger. After being discharged from the hospital, they returned home and everything felt like a fresh start. One evening, as Jack arrived home from work, he stopped in the yard, and what he saw brought tears to his eyes. Nick was outside, laughing joyfully, building a snowman. His small hands were rolling the snow, his face glowing with happiness. He ran around, giggling just like the children Jack had watched in the daycare yard that day. A deep sense of peace filled Jack's heart. Everything he had feared had somehow worked out. His son was healthy, he had a stable job, and his family was happy. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, God." Because even in the darkest moments, there was always a light of hope. And Jack had learned that better than anyone. This was the beginning of a brand new hope-filled chapter in their lives. Please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications to support us.